Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Hello, and a warm welcome, everyone, to today's webinar on India's first National Time Use Survey 2019. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sri Rupa, and I am a postdoc with the Laws of Social Reproduction project at King's College London and CWDS Delhi. For today's webinar, we are joined by Professor Prabha, PI of the Laws of Social Reproduction project, and 6 distinguished speakers: Professor Devaki Jain, Professor Indira Hirve, Dr. Valeria Esquivel, Professor Neeta N, Professor Ashwini Deshpande, and Mr. P.C. Mohanam. We are very honored to have an inspiring panel of feminist economists and statisticians from the Global South to discuss India's first national time use survey. Our speakers would examine the potential of time use surveys to make women's invisible, unpaid subsistence work, unpaid care and domestic work visible, and its role towards acknowledging the vital contribution of women to the productive and reproductive economy. The session would be chaired by Professor Prabha Kotishwaran, who is the Professor of Law and Social Justice at the King's College London, Dixon Poon School of Law. I now welcome you, Professor Prabha, to chair the session.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sri Rupa, and a very warm welcome to all of you for joining us today at our webinar on time use surveys, which we've planned to coincide with International Time Use Week. Now, we approach this discussion on time use surveys through the lens of social reproduction. Now, a major component of social reproduction is the unpaid care and domestic work that women perform all around the world. And unpaid domestic and care work has for long captured the imagination of feminists for several decades now. So we can recount Marxist, socialist, and autonomous feminists who in the 70s talked about the domestic labor debates and called for wages for housework in a critical way. We can think of how they chronicle the international sexual division of labor and the housewifeization in the Global South in the 1980s. We can think of literature on global care chains starting in the 1990s. We can think of post-structuralist feminists who've also been talking about life's work, and of course, liberal feminists who have focused their attention on workplace equality and work-life balance. Now, this focus on unpaid care and domestic work has received a new lease of life with the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular SDG 5.4, which calls on states to recognize, reduce, and redistribute unpaid care and domestic work. Now, as numerous international organizations present the burdens of unpaid care and domestic work as a barrier to female labor force participation rates, feminist economists have offered more nuanced explanations to argue for better measurement of the high levels of paid and unpaid work that women in fact are doing. Now, feminist economists have already had an important role to play in redefining what is known as a production boundary set out by the UN System of National Accounts. To refresh our memories, the SNA includes paid work within the production boundary. It also includes certain forms of unpaid work within the production boundary, such as unpaid family work in family enterprises, subsistence production of goods by households, and free collection of products such as water, fuel, wood, fish, and fruit for their own consumption, and the collection of free goods for use for production purposes such as fodder, wood, and craft material. Then there is unpaid work, which is not part of the production boundary, and this includes daily activities for household upkeep, such as cooking, washing, cleaning, and shopping for one's own household, care work, and then unpaid voluntary services. Now, these definitions of what counts as productive work have crucial ramifications not only for economic policymaking, but also for recognizing women's work and redistributing resources to improve their well-being, both material and otherwise. And so the first Pan-India time use surveys become quite crucial in this respect. So this time use survey was conducted pre-pandemic between January and December 2019 and covered 1.39 lakh households across the country and 4.47 lakh persons above the age of 6. Now, clearly post-pandemic, with a dramatic reduction in the amount of paid work and the dramatic increase in the amount of unpaid work, I think there couldn't be a better time to actually think about time use surveys in our context. So to help us make sense of this report, and I know it's been widely reported in the media in India, so I won't go over the startling findings. We have today 6 distinguished speakers. Our first speaker is Professor Devaki Jain, who's a prominent feminist economist and who's the founder of the Institute of Social Studies Trust and a founding member of the Indian Association for Women's Studies and Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era. She's a recipient of the Padma Bhushan in 2006 and is most recently author of The Brass Notebook. Neeta N is professor and acting director at the Center for Women's Development Studies in New Delhi, and she has written extensively on labor markets, women's migration, and women's employment, particularly domestic work. And her recent book is titled Working at Others' Homes, The Specifics and Challenges of Paid Domestic Work. Ashwini Deshpande is professor of economics and the founding director of the Center for Economic Data and Analysis at Ashoka University. She has published widely on the international debt crisis of the 1980s, on globalization and development, as well as on the economics of discrimination and affirmative action. Her recent book is Grammar of Caste, Economic Discrimination in Contemporary India. We then have Indira Hir, director and professor of economics at the Center for Development Alternatives in Ahmedabad, and she's interested in various dimensions of development, including alternatives to dominant development paradigms, and is a pioneer in the field of time use surveys. And she's published several books, notably Unpaid Work and the Economy, and Mainstreaming Unpaid Work, Time Use Data in Developing Policies. We then have P.C. Mohanan, who's chairperson of the Kerala State Statistical Commission. And before that, he worked at the Indian Statistical Service for 35 years as part of the National Sample Survey Organization and the Central Statistical Organization. He was a member of the National Statistical Commission and its acting chairman. Last but not the least, we have Valeria Esquivel, who is employment policies and gender specialist at the International Labour Office in Geneva. Before that, she had a long academic career as a feminist economist, publishing extensively on labor, macroeconomic and social policies, and time use studies, particularly in the Global South. And she has co-authored the reports Innovations in Care, New Concepts, New Actors, New Policies, as well as Care Work and Care Jobs for the Future of Decent Work, published by the ILO in 2018. So our speakers will present for about 10 to 12 minutes, and all attendees will be muted during the presentations, which is why I think you might be finding that you can't unmute yourself. You can definitely post your questions in the chat box during the presentations. And once the presentations are complete and we open up for Q&A, you raise your hand and we will unmute you so that you can ask your questions. This session will be recorded, so it will be then made available on our website in due course. And for those of you who are tweeting, our hashtags for today's events is hashtag value unpaid work, hashtag time use. So over to you, Professor Jain.
Well, thank you so much, all of you, particularly Prabha and Srirupa, for including me. But I must say, I feel a bit like Rip Van Winkle. So long ago, 40 years ago, or even 45 years ago, I did what was called the first time use study. And now to be with all of you feels like I'm not really appropriate, but I'm very grateful that I got a chance to see all of you and hear you also. So we did supposedly the first time use study. It was in 45 years ago, 1975, 77. And many of you probably were not born then. Unfortunately, it never got published in an academic journal, but I believe, thanks to Sonal Desai, it's been uploaded in some social science website. But what continues to be a current preoccupation in my mind, sorry, I have to go down, yeah, and in many others too, is notifying accurately the roles that women are playing in the economy in the conventional sense, that is in adding to good old GDP, but not yet sufficiently recognized. Though many of you are going into other areas like care work, I'm still obsessed by wanting to show women's role in what is called the formal economy, and therefore to benefit from wage fixation and other securities. My proposal to the ICSSR 45 years ago was based on the hypothesis that female work participation in India was under-enumerated because of the nature of female work. The primary objective of the study was to test this hypothesis. A second objective was to try to identify the various determinants of female labor supply. A third was to regroup productive and non-productive in the old-fashioned sense activities and define gainful activity on the basis of the evidence. There were hordes of persons who helped us. Malini, I wish you could be here, and myself and a few others at the time in ICSST got this study done and also processed and submitted. We have acknowledged all of them in the full paper, which is available on the website SSRN, thanks to Sonal. As I understand it, the current trend is to expand the concept of economy to include care work, what traditionally we used to call the 3 C's, cooking, cleaning, and caring for the child. We were more preoccupied to reveal that women who were engaged in the conventional definition of productive work, work which adds to the conventional components of GDP, that were being missed out. And as I mentioned earlier, the missing out had many losses, not only the cover of labor laws, but also other inputs like skill development, organized power, unionization, respect. We chose 2 very different agroclimatic zones deliberately, Rajasthan for the dry and West Bengal for the wet cultivation. Our samples were very small, but we stratified them according to land ownership as a proxy for economic class. To challenge the conventional method of counting workers, we designed our field work to coincide with the NSSO. You know what the NSSO is. As they went into the 32nd round in the year 1977, we picked up a sub-sample of households from their own sample. When we gave our final tables, we could compare what we found and what they found. We thought it was the most persuasive way of doing advocacy. Our investigators were 2 in West Bengal and 2 in Rajasthan, observed and recorded without a code what individuals in a sampled household were doing from about 7 in the morning till about 7 in the evening. Along with that, they also watched and recorded what children were doing at the same time. So we have wonderful data on child workers. The questionnaire was an open sheet with half-hour time intervals on one side, and the observed tasks were filled by the investigator on the other side. There is no time to mention more, but here is a table which shows what we found and how it compares with the NSSO at the same time in the same areas. The table shows some dramatic differences between our counting and the NSSO's counting. So I have put up this table, I'm sure all of you can see it. So we have the time dispensation shows 80%, whereas the NSSO shows 52. And the more dramatic one is West Bengal, where we were always told by the NSSO that women are the culture prevents them from coming out to work. But when we did the time use, we found 15 according to NSSO and 34 according to us. The inclusion of women via time use is dramatic. So I showed you what happens in West Bengal. This laid to rest the belief that in West Bengal, women were not permitted to work for livelihood. Indeed, these women did not get wage or identification as contributors as a result of not being identified as workers. They were processing the harvested paddy in many ways, dehusking, making murmura for sale. They were invisibilized, a form of oppression. I have no idea if these attitudes have changed over the 40 years. Ashwini and Naila are doing a study in West Bengal. They may be able to tell us. 2 findings of ours, of which we are very proud, is that since we classified according to what is called class at that time, class defined by size of land ownership, starting with the landless, we found that amongst the landless households, that to be the poorest, women were more engaged in income-earning activities than men. This made sense to me because it's always been my belief that amongst the poor, the women drive themselves almost to death to enable their families to survive, when men might even bury their sorrow of unemployment through drinking. So here's a table which shows work participation rates by land classes and sexes in the surveyed villages, census of households. And you will see landless women 74%, men 67%, and you go down and you will see the table. I don't want to spend time reading out the table, but I'm sure many of you can see that as you go up land ownership, the women's participation declines. And then you see West Bengal, which was considered 11% according to NSSO female participation. But then you see when you do time use, we found it was quite much more than we thought. So there were no tablets or other devices at those days to store the data. So recording was all handwritten. We took it for processing to the Institute of Economic Growth. The raw schedules are stored in the library of the CDS in Trivandrum. And for anyone who wishes to check as well as redo currently to record change, to be really a treasure trove. Our report, which we called Report on a Time Allocation Study, its methodological implications, was presented at a seminar held at the Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi University in 1982. Stalwarts in economics and statistics such as Shukumar Chakravarti, Pranab Bardhan, Hanumant Rao, and many others, including K.N. Raj, listened to our advocacy and also presented papers. The seminar and its papers are available in the ISST library, unfortunately not published as a book, but I welcome any of you to take it over and publish it as a book because it has, as I said, papers by all these stalwarts like Shukumar, Pranab, Hanumant Rao. We could not... Am I okay?
Yeah. Go ahead.
5 minutes over? Okay. The seminar...
Yeah, there are 5 minutes left, Professor.
How many
Jain.
minutes?
5.
How many? Oh,
5.
lovely. We could not stop with revealing this injustice or lack of accuracy, but we wanted to show NSSO that their questionnaire was a trap for women to push them into what is called Code 93. It is the code which says, I do not belong to any of the other 92 occupational codes, so I'm pushed into only domestic duties as the language of those days, which is the issue that many of you are now engaged with. While advocacy at the time did not go into asking for a national time use study, which you all have done, our advocacy was basically to change the questionnaire and ask different questions so that we can net women's economic activity and reveal the truthful work participation rate of women. There's a block in the NSSO schedule called Block 5. I've discussed this with Ashwini, which asks the respondent to fill in what they did for half days on a previous week. We suggested that this is canvassed on all the respondents, not only those who are already netted into the worker category. The answers can reveal the uncounted women workers. Pranab Bardhan, at that time chairman of NSSO, added some questions for the 32nd round, which really watered down our suggestion because there were supplementary questions and the answers did not come into the main numbers that we are interested in. I'm hoping that current soldiers like Ashwini will take this forward. The main obstacle to change is international comparability, as well as comparability over time. We need to fight that now. Later on, I found that using time as a measure in other occupations can lead to enabling policy responses. We did a study of time spent by women in dairying households in Kheda district, where the Amul is located. We found that women were busy in what can be called dairying, looking after the cattle, feeding, milking, bathing, for 10 hours. In examining the mortality rates of women across age, we found that women in the reproductive age had unusually high mortality rates because of this 18-hour day. I'm happy to tell you that we pointed it out to Dr. Kurian, then chairman, and he created an infrastructure that this load was reduced. So in other words, time can be used not only for correcting the national data, but also for short and dirty studies to show the burden that women are carrying and therefore call for intention. So this paper or the results have been published in an article in EPW, 26 October 1996, for those who want a reference. I've called it Time as a Measure of Value, and we began to do short and dirty studies after that. So to come back to my story, I think inclusion of women in the formal economically defined workforce is still an important challenge. Working for bread and overworking and dying as a result of that work is a phenomenon in parts of Asia, in most of Africa. I think in countries like ours, to concentrate on care work is somewhat of a mismatch between our conditions of reality. There's so much maybe an issue in the Anglo-Saxon countries where domestic help is not available. This is where I think the internationalism of the women's movement has led us astray. The affirmation of the difference between us and them is getting muted by some feminist solidarity and feminist intellectual space. Of late, I have found that the feminist movement in Africa is affirming our difference with the northern countries. Therefore, our first priority, I want to end by saying, needs to emphasize that women are contributing to the GDP in the production of goods and services, which are considered worthy of GDP. Identify the women and ensure they are included as labor and are able to access the various support that labor is entitled to, including unionization. I would like to acknowledge right now the assistance of Shivangi, my assistant, in preparing all this stuff for web presentation, in which I'm not very good. Thank you. Am I within the time?
Yes, absolutely. Perfectly.
Thank
you. Thank you so much, Professor Jain, for those sobering words and words of caution for feminist priorities. So next we move on to Professor Neeta.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So I will share a PPT little later, 1 minute later. Basically, I had agreed to speak on the methodological and conceptual issues of the official time use survey data, the pilot 1998-99 and the 2019 data. Let me just start sharing it. I hope the PPT is visible to all.
Yes.
Yep.
So as I have said that the time use survey 1988-99 was a standalone pilot survey, and the number of households covered and the number of people covered in that survey was not so much compared to 2019 survey. In both these surveys, in fact, we have taken members from those households who are 6 years and above. So both the time use surveys had the same age criteria in terms of selecting the participant. The 1998-99 survey actually focused more on unpaid economic work, and it is very clear even from the introduction to the report that unpaid economic work was given priority over the unpaid housework or care work. And if you look at the activity schedule that the 1998-99 survey used, this becomes much clearer. Unlike the pilot survey, the 2019 survey was actually framed around the question of time distribution, and it does acknowledge the importance of capturing unpaid housework and care work. So if you look at both these rounds have used what is called the interview method. So where we have a predefined schedule, three schedules that were three defined sets of questions. One is on household characteristics, one on individual characteristics, and the third one on time deposition of selected individuals. So if you look at the household characteristics at the 1998-99 pilot survey, actually had few more questions which are now, if you look at the 2019 survey, that's much more organized, and but it does, both these surveys capture the broad basic information. Interestingly, the 2019 survey has some additional questions which are very important actually if you want to look at housework. Basically questions on source of energy for cooking, lighting, what kind of technology is used for washing clothes, kind of sweeping arrangements or sweeping mode, and the members of households above 5 years needing special care. These are very important information. I think it is very important to anyone who's interested in looking at care and housework. But the problem is that when it is recorded, it's basically recording only the primary or major source, and we know what the understanding of primary actually differ. And there could be multiple primaries also as far as a household is concerned. So, and I think this unified understanding that there will be only one primary, primary source is something which I think the questionnaire really didn't address. If you look at the individual section, what the broad, kind of information is there compared to the pilot survey. The 2019 survey actually has included transgender, which is definitely a welcome thing. And it actually, the problem with 2019 survey is that in the individual section, there is no subsidiary status that is recorded as far as the economic activity is concerned. The principal activity is recorded, but not the subsidiary status. And this is really an issue for women. We know many women are actually working in terms of, as subsidiary workers. Interestingly, the consumption data is something which is very important, and I think but not much thinking has gone into how it has to be collected. But there is what you call, it is basically an aggregate of 5 different heads, and here imputed values of home-based, like homegrown things, and imputed value of wages paid in kind through free collection, gifts, etc. also are figured, but one doesn't know how are these imputation being done, how are this data calculated, was it left to definitely it would have been left to the investigators to do it. So that will something that I think we may have to discuss. I don't know what happened, suddenly it went off.
We can see it, Anita.
You can see it?
Yeah, it's not, yeah, maybe you
I
can
don't
go
know
back
what
to slide.
happened.
Yeah.
Suddenly there was some issue. So if you look at the 1988 pilot survey and the 2019 survey, the pilot survey was administered in 4 quarters to account for the seasonal variations, which it is not there in this 2019 survey. 2019 survey is actually based on 1 day, and it is basically a normal day or any other day. And these details are available, and I am not going into the details of it because of shortage of time. I am not sure as to how the 2019 survey the seasonal factor is accommodated, because for rural areas it's very important, for if you want to look at work, especially women's work, the seasonal factor has to be accommodated, which is not specified in the 2019 report. So I'm not maybe Sri PC Mohanan could throw more light into it. How is it then taken care of? The recall method was used, and 24 hours time activity was captured. Here in compared to the 2098-99 survey, this time 30 minutes time slot was used. Earlier it was 1 hour time slot, but here it was 30 minutes time slot. Internationally also, I think 15 to 30 minutes is what is an accepted time slot. So that means we really have now kind of looked at some of our previous experience and have changed our time slot understanding of capturing time-based activities. So in 1998, if you look at the activity classifications, we had come up with our own classification, and this really was a problem in terms of international comparison and also comparison with labor statistics, even within at the macro level, at nationally also. 2019 activity status is based on the International Classification of Activities for Time Use Statistics, 2016, where we used the pre-coded activity classification in this round. If you look at an important issue that has been raised and has been discussed in the time use context is about multiplicity of activities. In the 98-99 survey, the multiplicity issue was addressed in a very limited manner. Field workers determined actually the main and secondary workers. The time slot was left open and activities were recorded, but it was the investigator who decided as to what is the secondary and the primary activity, and economic activities were given priority over other activities. It is very clear from the report that was the approach that was followed. As against this, 2019 survey actually had had a 10-minute kind of a division. So if there were multiple activities done during the same time slot, 10 minutes, 3 activities were recorded, only 3 activities were allowed to be recorded, and each activity was given 10 minutes each, in the schedule. The question is that if about simultaneity. Because we know in our context there are many activities, multiple activities which are taken up simultaneously. So a mother could be cooking and also minding the child. So there is an overlap and there is a simultaneity to it. I take 5 more minutes. So that is an issue which actually now both these surveys, whether it is the pilot survey or the main survey, has not actually given enough attention to it. I will just skip some of this because I think it is if you look at the questionnaire, there are important questions that are there. There are important concerns as to what is being recorded as major activity, minor activity. When you have multiple activities, all those are issues. Now, let me come to the whole assumption that is there behind all time use surveys, which is there for our two surveys as well. One is the measurability assumption. The assumption that paid economic activity like unpaid work is performed continuously and measurable. So, if, obtaining detailed information on daily time schedule, as we know, is not easy. And we need to have probing questions. And investigators, since they are asked to finish a large number of questions, this has happened in our pilot round also, we actually end up not having those kind of information, quality information that is there, and it is very much there in the question if you look at. I'll come to the data, 2 slides on it a little later. And another issue which I think it is important is to understand unpaid work in the larger cultural social context. And we know in our Indian context, even when we talk to women, there is always underrepresentation of the manual physical labor, underrepresentation of the emotional labor, and overrepresentation of manual physical labor. And this is something which is very much clear in the data that if you look at, this is a table which you can clearly see. If you look at the unpaid caregiving services of household members, if you look at it, participation rates are also very low compared to unpaid domestic services, which is a physical manual part of it, and participation rate is very low. And much more important is if you look at the time, if this is for participants who are actually performing care work. 132 minutes, that means 2 hours is when people are performing, and look at the participation rate is just 28%. It means that only 28% of women in rural areas and 26.3% of urban women are participating in caregiving, which is, I feel it's not a correct finding if you have any sense of what the field is like and the issues are. And it is actually very important to look at this table where the calculation is for the time spent is for all women or all men. So here, if you look at, it's just 37 minutes. If all women are taken into account who are, and their care distribution is taken, 37 minutes in a day for rural areas and 36 minutes for urban areas. I think it is a huge underrepresentation of care work. And that is something which, in the questionnaire, if you look at, we have not actually accounted for these issues and didn't have any variables also collected in the data in terms of contextual variables. I think it is important to and this is a discussion that was there even in the pilots after the pilot survey results were out, that the contextual variables as to with who is an important question, and that is actually not accounted even in this round of survey. And so I think though the data is a welcome move, and there are many more improvements to the data now, still there are many gaps, and it is important for us to engage with the data sets. And also when we analyze these data sets, the limitations of the time use data and the way it is collected is important to be highlighted, to be flagged. And this also should also kind of let us help in designing future surveys of this kind. I hope I am on time. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Neeta. To continue, unpacking the 2019 surveys, we now have Professor Deshpande.
Very much. I'm going to start my sharing my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
But I can't see it.
We can see it.
I don't know how to. Oh, now I can see it. All right. So because the time limit is very short, I'm going to just dive straight into it. Thank you for inviting me. I am absolutely not an expert on any of these topics, and I'm learning a lot. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to learn. So I was looking at the history of time use surveys, and I was surprised to find that it actually has a long history of time use diaries dating back to the 19th century. So the first instance that was recorded was before 1900 in the Russian zemstvo, which are the rural country or regional administrative units. which were monitoring the time spent by peasant households on different activities. After that, in the earlier 20th century, you have several instances. For example, the time use diaries for London women in 1913, London factory workers, Bevan 1913, Russian workers 1925, and the US Department of Agriculture in 1929 came up with time use diaries for farm, town, and college educated elite women. The Soviet interest was actually spurred by the Marxist notion of the worth of an object being determined by the amount of labor time embodied in it. So the early use of the time use diaries was really to sort of weigh different services or objects by the amount of labor time embodied in it. But the later studies that I have listed and the motivation that we have for time use service contemporarily is to do with investigation into the position of women. Now, one of the paradoxes that the US experience noticed was that along with the technological revolution, as labor-saving devices became plentiful, for example, not washing clothes by hand, but running them through a washing machine, paradoxically, that increased the amount of unpaid domestic work time in the US. So when washing machines got invented, clothes started to get washed more frequently as opposed to when they were being washed. Yes?
Sorry, can we just see your slides in a slideshow format, please? If you just go up to slideshow.
End show, okay.
No, slideshow, up at the top. Towards the right, if you can just go to it and start displaying, then we can see it better.
My slides? Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can, but if you just hit play on the top right-hand corner, it'll be a bit bigger for us. Yes.
Right.
Perfect. Sorry. Yes,
okay.
you were talking
so
about.
I covered this slide. This was where I was. Are we in sync now?
No, you're still on the first slide. On the cover slide.
Okay, I am number 3. So, okay.
If you can make it full screen, that would help.
Sorry?
If you just go to play on the top right and
that's exactly what I did.
Okay.
That's exactly what I did.
I think it can be made a bit bigger if you.
It's on my full screen. I'm on full screen right now.
Okay, press F5.
Shall I share at the back?
Sorry?
Professor Ashwini, shall I share it for you?
Well, yes, but let's see, because Devaki's thing we never got to see.
That was a Word file. Yours is a PPT.
Okay, start, then go to the first slide. I'm going to stop sharing. Yeah.
You can see it actually. Just carry on.
Okay, could you can share it?
Yeah. Just give it a second.
Because on my thing, it was full screen and I was sharing it. I mean, I could see the transitions.
Let's carry on, Prabha, so that we can all understand.
Okay, so that's the first slide. Next one, please. Yeah, this is the first substantive slide where I was talking about, I was on this slide, please, just wait here. So I was talking about the technological revolution that led to the proliferation of labor-saving devices. And paradoxically, that was seen also to be associated with an increase in unpaid domestic work time in the US. So for example, the presence of a washing machine also meant that clothes got washed more frequently compared to when they were being washed by hands, etc. So basically the idea was, so the focus on measuring the amount of time spent on various kinds of activities, paid and unpaid, started to motivate the time use service, which is different from the Marxist interest in time spent. The current model of time use service goes back to the mid-1960s, which is the UNESCO harmonized cross-national time use study for 12 countries, which, having been tweaked now, is the model for the contemporary time use service. Next slide, please. Yeah. So this is the sort of the latest, the biggest international time use survey, which is the multinational time use survey study, which is hosted in Oxford. It gets updated continuously. It's 23 countries between 1960 to 2010 at different points in time. And these slides can be shared with you. But basically, if you see the top graph, the bottom, the x-axis is the proportion of time spent in paid work, and the y-axis, the vertical axis, is the proportion of time spent in unpaid work. And there are, on the left-hand side is the panel for women, on the right-hand side is a panel for men. So there seems to be some convergence or some gender equality across these two kinds of work between men and women. So that's what the top graph is showing. The bottom graph on the left-hand side is men, minutes per day, general housework. On the right-hand side is women, minutes per day, general housework. Now, overall, you see that over time, for women, the trend is downwards, but the levels are much higher. For men, the trend is upwards or often flat, but the levels are much lower. So overall, for the globe as a whole, internationally as a whole, the gap is decreasing between both paid work and unpaid work, but the disparities in both paid work and unpaid work remain pretty substantive. And of course, there's a lot of regional variation, which I'm not going to go into. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Indian Time Use Survey 1998, Neeta already talked about it, so I'm not going into the details of it. But what I really liked about this report of the pilot survey is that the way in which the report is written, and Devaki had some role to play in that report, is that it quantifies the contribution of women in the national economy and tries to estimate gender discrimination in household activities. So they define the system of national accounts, so the conventional economic activities, the SNA activities. It defines something called the extended SNA activities. And if you look at the sum of the SNA and extended SNA activities, then you actually find that the share of women's work to total work is about 55%. So the point about women doing unpaid economic work, which is the extended SNA, is an extremely important one. And this is something that my work with Naila Kabir also, we talk about this, which is over and above care work, which of course women do much more than men. The extended, if you include extended SNA work, then you actually find the labor force participation, which is not the conventional labor force participation rate of women, to be much higher. And so I think the Indian Time Use Survey of 1998 is very valuable because it makes, even though it's only 6 states, it actually makes this point really pretty dramatically and emphatically. Next slide, please. Coming to the 2019 Time Use Survey data, of course, it's all India. It's much more detailed than the first report, but unfortunately, it doesn't have that same framework of SNA, non-SNA, SNA and extended SNA. So this has SNA, non-SNA, and other activities. And so you have to really cull out similarities in terms of, comparing it to the previous Time Use Survey, and also in terms of looking at unpaid economic work, so that it needs more work to sort of formulate the findings that way. But here are some quick figures from that. Now, if you look at employment-related activities, and this is for 6 years and older, so you find rural men spending about 434 minutes per day, which amounts to about 50.63 hours per week. Rural women is 37 hours per week. Urban men 59, about 60 hours a week, and urban women about 44 hours a week. So you see these gender disparities very clearly between men and women in both rural and urban areas as far as employment-related activities are concerned. Next slide, please. And if you just take a figure from this from this survey, which just looks at broadly just SNA and non-SNA, not the same framework as the pilot study, and you break it down by age groups. So 15 to 59 years is the working age group. And if you focus in on these two middle bars in both the charts, you see the gender disparities in paid work, which is SNA work, and non-SNA work, which is unpaid work, very, very clearly. And this just doesn't include only care work, but it also includes economic unpaid work. And this is the gender disparity that we need to talk about in terms of measurement, also in terms of paid and unpaid. So the fact that women, so all the issues that Devaki was raising are very relevant here, because women are doing economic work, but they're not getting counted as workers, and therefore any of the benefits that workers can avail of are not available to women who do unpaid economic work. Next slide, please. Of course, there are regional caste differences in this, but I don't have time to go into that. Now, here is what a snapshot looks like, of the total time in a day per person spends in different economic activities. On the top, the pie chart is for men, and at the bottom, the pie chart is for women. And the big difference you see is the blue slice for men, which is employment and related activities, and the green slice for the dark green slice for women, which is the unpaid domestic service. And so that's really the big contrast between men and women in India. And when you look at the ratios here, compared to the pilot, it doesn't seem like there's been a huge improvement in the last 20 years. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is included in unpaid domestic service, which is that green big slice in the women's pie chart? So there are these fancy names: food and meal management and preparation, cleaning and maintenance of one's own dwelling and surroundings, etc., etc. These are fancier descriptions for two of the three C's, which is cooking and cleaning. So do-it-yourself maintenance, repair, and decoration, etc., etc. So this is all the work that needs to be done to keep the household running. And this is the unpaid domestic service. And women spend about 10 times more time on these activities compared to men. And this is a similar order of magnitude also in the 1998 survey. So, in the 20 years, you don't see a huge change in terms of unpaid domestic work. Next slide, please. So one of the takeaways that we see from the 2019 Time Use Survey is the sexual division of domestic work. And India and Pakistan have amongst the most unequal divisions within the household of this. So there is no evidence of male-female convergence so far, at least in the Time Use surveys. Neither is there evidence of convergence with the international trends, which is gradually, not so dramatically, but gradually pointing towards a closing of the gap. So what the point that we need to understand is that because somebody is doing the domestic chores, that is what allows the productive economy to continue. Men would not be able to go to work if they had to do all this work first at home. Right? And so my work with Naila Kabir also points to the same factor, which is a big constraint for women to access paid work, provided when paid work is available. I mean, that's also a big issue of it not being available. But whenever it is available, the big constraint is their primary responsibility of domestic chores. And this is not care. This is real manual hard work that needs to be done. Over and above, they also, of course, have to perform the caregiving roles. Today, in fact, BBC has this very interesting story about the massive gains that have been achieved globally of gender equality within the household is under the threat of derailment because of COVID. And they warn against the risk of reverting to the 1950s gender stereotypes, where the woman stays at home, takes care of the children and all the housework, and the man is involved in the paid job. And what they point towards is that we talk about safety nets issued by the government, but the fact that women take care of unpaid work at home, this has been the biggest social safety net in the world, and that's under threat right now because of COVID, right? So that is the world is on the verge of going back to that old-fashioned safety net and withdraw, as women withdraw from the labor force everywhere because of the pressures of just managing domestic work and COVID. I have looked at some data coming from a private data source called CMIE, which also collects not such a detailed information, but about some data about time spent on domestic chores. And the first month of the lockdown in India, April 2020, saw an increase in men's hours spent on domestic work by close to 1 hour. So there was a definite reduction in the gender gap. But by August, already men's time had reduced. The only good news is that in August, men's time hasn't regressed back to the pre-pandemic level. It's still higher than that. So I don't know whether this is just green shoots of some elements of gender equality within the home, or it's just fluke and then it's going to go back to the the habits that we had pre-pandemic. It's too early to tell. We'll have to wait for more data. Next slide, please. Finally, I'll end with this. I'll leave you with this picture. This is a picture drawn by a young boy in Kerala when some surveyor went to their home, and the man said, they said, what do you do? What does your wife do? And the man said, my wife doesn't work. And the son made this drawing of his mother. This is a non-working mother. So this is all the work that she's doing throughout. This is the son watching his mother. And so it's an ironical statement where women are simultaneously doing all of these things, which the time use surveys are supposed to capture, but their society and their families believe they don't work. I'll end with that. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ashwini. That was really very insightful. And it just points to the challenges of actually doing these time use surveys with rigor and detail. So we now move on to Professor Indira Hirve, who will reflect on some of the shortcomings of the 2020 report.
Shall I start now?
Yes, please.
Yeah, you have my PPT, isn't it?
Yeah.
So
shall I share it, Professor?
Yeah. Let me first give you by way of introduction that this time use survey has been all India survey, which includes all the states of the country except for Andaman Nicobar, and this is a big achievement in itself because it's a large sample. And with this kind of a large sample, dealing with time use, collecting data is a huge achievement, and that's why I would like to congratulate the MOSPI. I was a member of the expert committee that designed the survey, but the implementation was, of course, in the hands of MOSPI staff and this thing. But as they say, there is always an improvement possible for any survey. And I discussed with one of the top officers in MOSPI, and he also agreed that there is always a scope to improve. And one has to think in terms of examining methodology again and again, so that at one stage we are able to accept, we are able to have a really efficient methodology. So I'm talking about basically, can you have this thing please, slide please, first slide.
Sure, just a moment.
In the meanwhile, I can say this, that, we had an opportunity to evaluate time use survey methodology in different countries. In 2010, I reviewed 60 time use surveys in developing countries. Later on, in 2018, I reviewed ESCAP countries, developing countries of ESCAP region. And Jack Shams is here. He reviewed time use surveys in Africa, and Valeria is there, and she reviewed time use surveys in Latin America. And we have come out with a book on this methodology and what we learned from this. Now, what is important findings of these reviews is that the time use survey has done little poorly at the global level, because 65 to 70% countries conducted time use survey, national time use survey using 24-hour time diary, and this mainstreamed it, otherwise not. So why these poor results? And we have come out with two major results. One is that not enough attention is paid to the details of the various components of time use survey. And the second was that it was difficult for countries to manage 24-hour time diary to collect detailed data of time use of people. Next one. Now, when I see our time use survey from that point of view, I have a few suggestions. And basically, this is a constructive suggestion, and this is something which we would like to go in the future. First is that, in objective, they have excluded employment. Now, this is a major loss because employment is something very important. And as Devaki pointed out, that informal work is intermittent, unstable, scattered, temporary, short-term, etc. frequently, and that's why LFS or EUS, Employment and Unemployment Survey, cannot capture it. And this is something which can be done by time use survey, which collects information on this completely. And the bias of women in reporting, underreporting their work also is not there because time use survey doesn't have any scope for bias. Another thing is that labor force survey is not equipped to collect certain data which time use survey can. For example, multiple jobs of people, or scattered nature of work, or time spent on any activity, that's intensity of work, or subsistence work, or simultaneous activities, work within the simultaneous activities. All this cannot be captured by a labor force survey. It is not equipped to do that, and that's why here also time use survey helps. Now, that is why I would say that both the survey, time use survey definitely helps in getting the data. Now, the 2017 survey has, in the background questionnaire, general employment status or something like that, which doesn't really say anything. In fact, ILO has said that annual status of work is not valid because nobody is able to tell you exactly as to how much time you have spent on work on a yearly basis. So there is a need to keep this point in mind, that we have to get employment in a specific way, in a more careful way, then only we can study the time use. And of course, as I have said earlier, that the ILO's new path-breaking conceptual framework, which talks about new definition of work, new classification of work, and new labor force status classification. This is important, but somehow we decided not to do it, and that's also another loss. So I think next survey we should pay more attention to that. The next one, please. Another weakness, yeah, please, next one. Another weakness we found was that each and every component is not paid, not received adequate attention. As we all know, time use surveys components are objectives, sampling, background questionnaire, data collection, TUS classification, and context variables. Now, TUS classification is something which is good now, because now recently in 16, UNSD had designed uniform classification, global classification, what you call. So it was an advantage for them. When we did 98 survey, we didn't have that, and that's why we had to formulate our classification. And that time, there was a huge problem of cross-country comparability. Now it will not be there. Now, another thing is that background questionnaire on all these things cannot be designed perfunctorily. They have specific requirements for time use, and that needs to be paid attention. Again, they are all linked with each other, and if you don't take care of the linkages, you don't get the right kind of data. For example, in the background questionnaire, you get information on paid and unpaid activities of or unpaid activities of men and women, which should be useful to us in analyzing SDG 5.4, which talks about gender inequality between men and women. But SDG 5.4 also talks about valuation. But there is nothing which can help us in valuation in this 2019 survey, because it requires data on assets, the technology capital used, and commuting assets for used in commuting, and many other durable goods, etc. We don't have those data. We don't even have data on ownership. We don't even have data on local wage rates, which are important in valuation. So we cannot really satisfactorily implement SDG 5.4 here. Similarly, we cannot use care economy from time use. We cannot study it very well from the 2019 time use survey. This is because care economy, just collecting data on how much time is spent on unpaid work is not enough. We have to, if you want to design some policies for that, we have to know as to how the care is organized at the household level. With the government, what is the government's role, what is the market's role, what is civil society role, and what is the household role. And then we know what is reality, and then we can formulate that. So that is also not there, etc. I think I'm getting late, so I just talked about data collection method in brief, that developed countries have a time use survey for 15 minutes time slot and self-reported, but we couldn't do it, and that's why we had to use face-to-face interview. But in face-to-face interview, one has to have detailed instruction, intensive training, strong follow-up, and rapport, etc., which wasn't perhaps done well, and that's why there are problems. But what is more important is that in face-to-face reporting, they decided to have only those activities which spend less than 10 minutes, which means we missed out many activities like fetching water. If I have a house, water in the water, I won't get that data. And that's why what data I will get is only about long distance fee. And that will not be correct. Similarly, if we don't have any data on minutes and just have 10, 10, 10 or 15, 15 divided like that doesn't really give you actual time spent on activities. So that's why that's another problem with this. And that's why I would say that another problem is that time use survey, the basic requirement is that you cannot use proxy. One has to use one's own time use because he's the person who knows it best. And also there will be biases if others report the data. However, in this time use survey, only 60% have reported their own, 40% have reported either with household other members or relatives or friends or whatever. So that is another way of creating the quality of data. And thirdly, what is the point in having major activity? I don't understand. In 23 minutes, why do you need a major activity? And that too determined by the respondent, which is not adequate at all. Simultaneous activities, if somebody has spent less than 5 minutes, if you divide that way, and then simultaneous activity is not considered. And that's why the quality of data is adversely affected in this manner. So that's another thing. And that's why I would like to go back to 98, next slide, 98-99 time use survey, that pilot survey is always for understanding the testing methodology and concepts and use the lessons into the full survey. Actually, immediately after the time use survey was done in 1999, R.N. Pandey, who was MOSP officer, and myself, both of us wrote separate papers on lessons to be learned from time use survey, and that could not be taken care of. Now, lessons learned, for example, that we should have more information in the background questionnaire if you want to valuation, because we wanted to do valuation, but we didn't have enough data. So we couldn't do that at all. And that's why we have to have more information about that. Then in order to get response, one has to focus more on interviewer, because in our kind of situation, interviewer is very critical. And we, of course, try to do this in a best possible way. But here you have to have strong follow-up, etc. You have to men-women teams you should have always. That also is necessary. But what is more important is that in time use in urban areas is a problem. We found it urban, because urban people are not interested in giving out their time, and they don't have time for time use data collection, etc. So what we recommended is that for under urban areas, literate population, we should have self-reported diaries, because they can do this, and we can also test the methodology. Again, there are a large number of things which have developed over time, and that's why we haven't taken care of the developments to learn the lessons. For example, pre-coded activities. That makes work very easy, because coding becomes a very difficult thing. Secondly, half-day interviews. Instead of interviewing at the end of the day, 24 hours, we interview only at the noon and in the evening. That gives you better data. And then use of technology. We can use a tablet for collecting data. And if the investigators are trained to go to the fieldwork with a tablet, then data entry, coding, everything takes place, and that becomes much more easier, and the time used survey can become much better. So what I would like to suggest is that, concluding, that time use survey is a different, I won't say difficult, it's a different survey because getting response from people to how they spend their 24 hours minute by minute is a difficult survey. And that's why we have to have intensive, which we try to do in 98, 99, that intensive instructions, follow up, training in local languages, and pilot testing, first of all, and continuously supervising. I think that is something we did because we were scared that if we don't do it well, then maybe Government of India will stop time use survey, then we'll worry about it. By the way, I was heading technical committee for the 98, 99 time use survey. And finally, I would, only one word, that time use survey is a very good, we have a very good experience of 2019, and we know how to improve. So we hope that in the future we'll be able to do it well, and we'll be able to use SDGs, time use for SDGs. We'll be able to have ILO resolution implemented in time use, and we will also be able to have other SDGs like time poverty and many other issues, employment and so on and so forth. So I end over here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Hirve. That was very illuminating. I think the last point about, looking at the SDGs in an interconnected manner, I think is really also very valuable in our context. So next we go to Mr. P.C. Mohanan, who will give us his point of view as, a government official actually conducting these surveys. Mr. Mohanan?
Yeah, I'm ready. It's okay. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, I'll be speaking from a slightly different perspective from what I've heard so far, because my experience has been mostly in the data collection and designing these surveys. Let me in the outset say, before the PPT is done, that we have been almost 22 years in waiting for this survey. There is lot many things to be unraveled. The report is, as usual, a very summarized version of the data, and in the coming days, a lot of research will be done using this data. A lot of things missing once you start working on the data. In particular, the survey collects mostly the data for 6 years. The household composition is not 100% available for us to understand the time use dimensions and the household composition. So there are some limitations like that comes to the fore. But in this short time available to me, I'll be speaking mostly on two aspects. One is the operational aspects of time use or any large-scale survey in India, and how the work-related estimates of the TUS compare with the employment survey available from other sources. So these are the two things I will take it up, because some of the issues have been covered by ma'am also in this presentation. If something is repeated, I will skip it. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, as she mentioned earlier, all large-scale surveys depends. Data collection has to be done through respondents and interviewers. And in this particular case, we have a problem of using any other method other than interview method. A diary method cannot be adopted in such a large-scale survey, or the participant observation in the investigator, which Devaki mentioned in the beginning, of the investigator observing the time use of the respondents. That's also not feasible. So as usual, we have adopted, the NSSO has adopted the interview method for this. And both are very important for data collection, as we say. The respondents are important. We will also look at in the next slide later on who are the respondents. And we have very little information about the interviewers in this particular survey. And third thing is that we need basically data from each members of the household, which is again not possible in our context of large-scale survey, where you have a time frame to be complete, for the survey to be completed, and then we have other limitations of the sample selected and the same household to be surveyed. And so we have very limited control over the respondents in all these surveys. It applies to NSSO for anybody who does these surveys. Now, in the pilot survey, operationally, the team, there's a team of one male and one female interviewers, and where female interviewers are not available, the local ANM or Anganwadi worker was taken for the survey. And the time users collected for individuals 6 years and above for 3 types of days, namely the normal day, abnormal day, and the weekly variant. The investigators actually went to the household first to find out the 3 different types of days from the different members of the household, and the survey program was prepared according to the days to ensure that all the 3 types of days were covered. In this particular 2019, what I understand is that the NSSO has done it with the help of contract investigators through an agency. I am not sure if the agency ensured the presence of female investigator. That is not very clear to us. And the time use data was actually planned to be collected for the individuals in the household. And the survey covered all the 7 days continuously. Of course, only 1 day data was collected from a particular household. And it was identified whether the survey was the day was a normal day or other day. And 90% of the day has been reported as normal day in the survey. The next slide. Sridhuba, can we go to the next one? Yeah. So we just look at the respondents in the survey. I just looked at the data, basic data, and tried to look at the characteristic of the respondents in this survey. And there are 2 respondents. One is the main household member who answers most of the questions relating to the household. And then there are the individual people who respond for the time use, wherever they could collect the individual data. So we have 2 respondents. And the overall respondent, we see that the female respondents were something like 44 or 45% in the rural sector and about 50% in the urban sector. So it's almost in the urban sector, male, female, 50-50. And this gender differences, you don't find in religious groups or social groups, you have the same percentage of respondents in rural and urban area. And if you look at who are the respondents in each household, you would find that 60% were actually the head of the household, either a male head or the female head. And about 30% of them were actually the spouse of the household head. So that accounts for something like 90% of the respondents. And the remaining were either some other member of the household, a unmarried child or a married child or somebody else. And in a few cases, we had people who are not actually some relatives and others. And a very small number were actually non-related. So you could see that, the survey, the way the survey data collected is not strictly, it's not uniform from house to house. And one has to look at what is the situation available. The next one. Yeah, this is the actual time reported for time use. In the rural areas, 56% they have self-reporting. So that means for the remaining, it is actually reported by some other member of the household. It's not the individual concern. The same thing with for women, it's about 66%. And urban area also you have close numbers. So it's not always strictly, it has not been possible for the interviewer to contact the individuals for getting the time use data. So you can understand there will be some issues relating to somebody else recalling the time use spent by another individual in the household. There could be some perceptions also coming into play in this thing when you are not the actual respondent. And remember, the data are collected the next day. I mean, you start asking questions about the previous day, morning 4 o'clock, and go up to the survey day of early morning 4 o'clock. So the 24-hour time is appropriately, appropriately coded into our intervals. So the reporting is generally done. You can see a large number of cases it is done by some other member of the household. Okay, the next one. Yeah, this is again, I was just looking at who are the respondents, the main survey respondents, what is the educational qualification, because these are important issues when you come to the data collection or understanding the objective of the survey. A very substantial number of people who are not really literate, who has furnished information. And of course, secondary and above the high educated people are quite high for male, and female is about 1/3. So there is a lot of differences in the education level of the respondent in both among the men and women. And that is the one factor that we have to remember when this data are analyzed. And again, let's go to the next one. So as I mentioned, the perception of the respondents in the absence of actual recording of time use in a diary, that is the main issue we have to keep in mind. And unfortunately, the report, is that does not detail anything about the field methodology. Unlike the 1998 survey, we had a lot of explanation about the methodology and the way in which the survey is conducted. I hope that as the issues of field issues, time survey operations. Some have been made, as we see, that this position is collected from concerned individuals, and it has been found successful because we have seen a certain number of respondents. And the thing I learned is that this data is actually collected.
Sorry, Mr. Mohan. Mr. Mohan, we are not able to hear properly. I think there might be some Wi-Fi issue at your end. Just that last sentence was not audible clearly. Your last sentence. It's still lagging a bit. So maybe you can turn off your video and speak.
Video. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the third issue which I mentioned was that the NSS appears to have made efforts to collect data from the individual respondents, and that has been partially successful, not fully. And the last point I wanted to make is that this data probably has been captured on a computer-aided machine in the field rather than a pen and pencil kind of pen and paper what we used earlier. So this is also an issue which might have a bearing on the probing and other issues, the data quality. So these are the issues on which I think the NSS has to come out and say or produce a technical report on the operational aspect, because that is a major issue, I think. Can you go to the next one? Is it okay? My audio is okay?
Yes, it's much better now. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, now I just look at the, just 3-4 minutes, I look at the, how are this work enumerated in the time use survey and the unemployment survey, how are they comparable? Now, briefly, the unemployment surveys considers all market production of goods and services, plus the production of primary goods for own consumption, plus the production of own account. These are the three broad considers economic activities. Now, in the time use survey, we have the activity codes 11 to 18, that is employment related activities, plus there are some parts of course 21 to 25, production of good for own final use, that also will actually come as part of economic activities used in the US. Now, TU has also a category called SNA production based on activity classification, and also another category called paid and unpaid. Now, one point we have to remember is the TUS participation in activities different from assigning the employment status code, which is actually mutually exclusive. And there's a priority criteria in the unemployment surveys, whereas the TUS participation may be overlapping. In a day, you might spend some time in work and some time in non-work. So there will be some difference. Let's keep in mind. Please go to the next one. Now, what I have done for this comparison is the employment and unemployed data are available from the what we call the periodic labor force survey, which is also conducted. We have 2018-19 reports. So that gives us the employment data from PLFS. And then in the time use survey, also the usual principal status has been collected, not the subsidy set. And then all these are available for 6 years and above in that report. I use this data. And nearest comparable data that I have for employment is the daily status if I use from the PLFS, because the TUS has got a 1-day reference period. And so what I did is that I took the previous day's daily status from the PLFS just for a few comparisons with the employment related results from the TUS. Now, if you see the first line, the TUS for the usual principal status, which is from the TUS report, it's 65% and 20% for rural male and female, and urban it is 62 and 16%. These figures are slightly higher from the comparable PLFS data on usual principal status, like it's only 57 for rural male. For female, it is much closer, 18.1 and 16.9. So there is slight difference I find in the principal status reported in the TUS. I'm not sure whether it is because of the agency or because of the enumerators who are used were new to the concepts. But I do find this difference. But if you come to the percentage of people participating in SNA activities in the TUS, that is from the statement 28 of the report, these figures come out very high compared to the NSS EUS. 65% for rural male and something like 39% for female. These are the participating in the SNA activities. And then urban area also, it's 60% and 23%. Now, another comparison we can make is percentage participating employment related activities, again from time use survey. Now, this is the 11 to 18 division 1 or what they call. These figures come to something like 56 only percent rural area, and for female is 19%. Now, these are comparatively much closer to the PLF's usual principal status figures. The employment, the time in minutes are given in the bracket. I don't go into that. Then the next line I have is the comparable figure I worked out from the PLFS, which is the daily status based work participation the day before the survey in PLFS, which is what should be strictly comparable with the TUSD. Now it is 53.6, 16.3, you have the figures there. And then look at the next line. These are the participation in paid activities in time use survey, very, very close to that, 53.6 and 53.4, 16.3, 17.7, 55 and 58, 14 and 50. So these two I do find really comparable, which means the paid activities in TUS are closely resembles the usual economic activity concept followed in the EUS. And the last line is again the I have a problem reading my production of goods for own use, which is of course not relevant to this, but it will be relevant later on when I go to another slide. Go to the next slide. Yeah, this is the one thing which apologies to Devagya ma'am for using the domestic work and code 93 here in the slide. But anyway, the NSS, you see domestic work plus economically useful work is code 93. That is given as 15% in the PLFS daily status and 4.2 for urban male. It's only for female. And the TUS, the same reporting as unpaid SN activities is 25.5 and 9.0. So you find that for TUS has actually recorded a much larger reporting. But then again, I said the employment unemployment surveys, we have a mutually exclusive priority criteria. In the TUS, it is simply participation. So one could participate in many things. So these are just percentage. So there is a reasonable comparison I find between 93 code used in the NSS and the reporting of unpaid SNF production. I mean, not very close, but still, I would say it's comparable. And unpaid non-SNA production is 84.2 and 82% of the area. So, move on to the next one. More. This is also an interesting, I think I'll take another 2 minutes. This is another interesting slide. Basically, the workers unemployed and out of labor force is as defined in the usual status in the TUS. And how many of them are actually reporting employment related activities? So in the rural male category, you look at workers, 82% of them actually reported 11 to 18, that is employment related. And then unemployed also has reported substantial number, 21% are reported. And then out of labor force also reports some employment related activities. The difference is coming basically because of the priority criteria used in the employment and the usual status concept used in. So one find that especially for female, you find, even though they're reporting out of labor force, the rural female, 22% are actually doing production of own goods for final use. And again, you have some 6% in the reporting employment related activities, though they are actually in the usual status out of labor force. So these are issues, the numbers that require a little more studies, analysis. Let's go to the last one, I think. Yeah, this is again the minutes. I don't want to repeat that. This is the time for spent in different activities compared to the, similar to the earlier one, where it was a participation. So time also, you can see substantial time is spent actually by even unemployed or out of labor force women in production of in employment activities as also in production of goods for own final use. One more. The next one. Yeah, I will just say that it's a significant step by MOSPI to further gender and time use understanding. Participation in paid activities, considering all activities in a time slot, shows a close relation with daily status estimates of PLFS. That is a minimum of 1 hour criteria for work. The unpaid activities needs more careful analysis. The report has been very patchy on that. And lack of more information, household assets and economic status and access to infrastructure, these are something which is not really not available. And we have also need to have much disaggregated analysis because the report basically gives you six years plus. That makes no sense actually. And even the 15 to 59 does not make sense because we know that up to the age of 18, most of the children are in the school. So you need appropriate age groups and some agreements on the criteria to be used for classifying a person as workers and non-workers, so that we have some kind of a final figures on the employed people from the TUS. So I would stop here, and if there are any queries later on, we can discuss. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Mohan. I think that is really quite valuable. I think, finally we go to Ms. Valeria Esquivel. And I guess, because there is always an issue around the take-up of time use surveys into the policy domain. So Valeria will be reflecting a little bit on that, on both, how comprehensive are these time use surveys and how they can feed into policymaking processes.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me and see me?
We can hear you, yes.
I will request in a moment to upload one presentation, but not yet. Thank you very much for the invitation and the many issues that have arose and are part of what we all grapple with in the South. And I think these tensions is not the problem. The problem is how we solve them. And so I will emphasize on several issues that were mentioned, and coming up with as someone who has also designed a time use survey and has to do with the limitations we always have. Invite us all not to compare us to some ideal that somewhere is there, but to strive to find solutions that really cater for our context. And I think in many instances, what Nita said, what Professor Hiwe said are associated with this. First, the first tension is the international comparability vis-a-vis the pertinence to the domestic context. And I think we have to really make this time use surveys pertinent to our context. Because that is what warranties really impact and incidence and being used. Having said that, the international comparability comes when we use the concepts in ways in which make sense to the international statistical community, if you want. Even if we might not completely agree, and those concepts also evolve, no? So if you could put up the presentation, I keep on going. I wanted to bring up the 19th ICLS. I don't see it shared. So if you, I think Srita received it. My presentation.
Dr. Valeria, it's being uploaded. Can you see it now?
Excellent, excellent. Leave it there for a second, and then we move to the third one, which is a table. So definitions and concepts have evolved, and what we, thanks to many of our thanks to many of you who were there in Beijing, were included in the platform for action, and the idea of measuring unremunerated work that women did was there in order, because we know that the dimension of we know that unpaid work and unpaid care work in particular and domestic work are defining dimensions of inequalities, of gender inequalities and inequalities more broadly. And Devaki reminded us of the class issue associated to the size of the land, if I understood correctly. So and from there onwards, in the last 25 years, also concepts have evolved. So if you could move to the third one, I wanted to show one table that, no, the previous one. One table that that is part of the Care Work and Care Jobs report, in which we try to put together the definitions that are currently being used, both the 19th ICLS Resolution 1, which is about labor force surveys, the ICATUS, the International Classification for Activities in Time Use surveys in 2016, which I understand was used in the Indian case, and a definition of care work, which comprises both unpaid care work and paid care work. And as mentioned several times, what the 19th ICLS has done is separating work from employment. So work is bigger than employment. And the first line is all the categories of work. And you see employment is one section of it because it's work for profit or pay, whilst the work we do for producing services and goods for own consumption are differentiated, because production of goods for our own consumption is part of S&A, whilst the production of services is what is typically unpaid care and domestic work. So having said that, the issue is then, what about the methods and how time use methods have evolved? And I think, again, there are always tensions, but the point is not to jeopardize the quality and validity of the data. And issues brought up by Professor Hirway, and also issues that were comments on the chat box, in terms of, for example, the idea of someone can reporting someone else's time use. That is something that is potentially a huge bias, and potentially because we don't know, we cannot tell. That's another problem. So how we do next time around, if you want to visit again the household, or to do or to replace the respondent, or there are issues that there are things that can be done to avoid, for example, that. So let me go back to the definitions. One sense is that in the what we call for short the care report for the ILO, we differentiated workers who are in employment and work for profit or pay from carers or caregivers. And that is because, and caregivers are those who perform unpaid care and domestic work from 1 hour to full day, because one person can be both a paid worker, a worker, as in labor force service, someone in employment, and a carer, an unpaid carer. And of course, we also focus there, but it's not today's issue, on paid care workers. So the section of workers that for profit pay provide care. So let me go back to the methods, and we can leave or close the screen. I will leave it there for you to to be able to grasp into these different categories. But let me go back to the issues of methods. And I wanted to say three things, because what Professor Nita presented also worried me in terms of capturing so very little of unpaid care work, both in participation and in minutes. And I have to tell you that the Buenos Aires Time Use Survey that I coordinated the collection of, also had 3 minutes time slots. But we said that there were up to 3 activities that could be collected within those, and those activities could be simultaneous or one after the other, and there were marks for that. And so eventually you could have, if all these activities were one after the other, you could have 10 minutes allocated to each. And if the activities were simultaneous, 30 minutes activity to, 2 simultaneous activities would be 30 minutes each, or 3 simultaneous activities, if you want, all of them at the same time, could have different allocations of time. So in that sense, the 30-minute slots is not a problem. The problem is this idea that there is a main activity and only that activity gets counted. Also, as far as I understand, the ICATUS 2016 is a very detailed classification of activities, and sometimes very detailed classifications do not match very large time slots. So if the activities are very detailed, then the time slots should be detailed. Also about the probing questions, but again, probing questions make sense if you have room in a time slot to incorporate activities. If not, you end up losing the activities that appear in the probing questions in the questionnaire. And then the issue of the domestic context and policy variables that should be both inbuilt into the questionnaires. It was mentioned at the beginning, a country where there is domestic help, that many households employed domestic workers. Well, that variable should be there, and even the hours the domestic worker works should be there. And if it's a live-in domestic worker, then in many places typically she more than he is considered part of a household, and the time use survey runs for her as well. So that's one. And the other is when we want these time surveys to inform policy, some policy variables, the availability of schools, of roads, of hospitals, how many children are attending a school, for how long, also should be there in order to understand the trade-off that the households face when we see only the snapshot of one day. And this has also this has bearings with target 5.4, which in reading the report, I understood that the reporting was being done as proportions of the day, and that I understand comes from the fact that the target 5.4 indicator of the SDGs is also variations in the proportions of time. So the proportion of time is important to capture that variation. But then, beyond that indicator is fairly aggregate, one needs to understand why things vary. So next time around, when we have another survey that is comparable to this one, has to be comparable because comparable at some level, but improving the depth of the data collection in order to be able not only to tackle or to show very big aggregates and even SDG indicators, but also to inform policy at a disaggregated level. And I will finish by reading aloud Target 5.4, which is a feminist fight, and it's the result of our feminist fights. And it's there bringing in what is called the 3R framework, which is for us is the 5R. For us, the ILO is 5 Rs. So if you can go to slide 24, please. Super. Very fast.
Could you stop me when we reach the slide required?
I think
the 24. The one before the last one.
24.
Sure, thanks.
And while I'll read the target 5.4, yeah, the previous one, yeah. It says, recognize and value unpaid care and domestic work. Up to there is the Beijing Platform for Action language updated only, through the provision of public services, infrastructure, and social protection policies, and the promotion of shared responsibility, blah, 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 blah. But I will stop in the provision of care services, infrastructure, and social protection policies, because that is there where we have the entry point for what we call care policies. So these time use surveys need to inform and be compatible with the definitions of employment we have, and we need to be able to capture in them informal, scattered ways of work that are not or become invisible for the labor force service, although labor force service should improve in order to capture them. And also time use surveys should serve the purpose of informing care policies along those 3 dimensions. What we say is that Target 5.4 is inspired in the triple R framework, and then what we call the 5R framework. The triple R framework is recognize, reduce, and redistribute unpaid care work, and you may know that the redistribution wording was contested at the time of the drafting of the SDG 5, and the solution was not having the redistribution wording there, but saying how we understand that unpaid care work is redistributed, which is through care policies. And at the ILO, we have added a preoccupation about paid care workers, which in this about care workers, which are for pay of profit, which in the context of COVID have been salient, and so it's more and decent work for care workers, more and better work for care workers, and the issues of representation, which in the ILO we understand are the way to improve care workers in general and care workers and female workers in particular working conditions. And with that, I close. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Valeria. Okay, great. So thank you all for being so patient. There's obviously been several questions in the chat function, and we'll try and consolidate some of them. So I think one of the main sort of conceptual questions that came up was around the ILO's definition of economic activity as, activity that's for pay or for profit, and how this fed into the time use surveys. I just wondered if, and how, the 2019 survey did not actually adopt this definition. Would any of you like to reflect on this aspect? Any of the
presenters?
Perhaps
the table I have can be put up, the third slide, so we see the definitions there.
Okay.
Can I add?
Yes, yeah. Please go ahead.
Just a moment.
Professor Hirve, I think you're muted.
You have to open it, huh? Yeah. The Indian Time Use Survey has adopted what you call ICATUS, that is International Classification of Time Use Activities, which is approved by UNST, United Nations Statistical Division, which is in custody of Time Use Survey. So that classification we have adopted, which means that we have similar concepts of employment and unemployment and underemployment, etc. At least in some ways there is a similarity. But the question is that when you undertake the survey, at that time you have to consider whether paid and unpaid work is there or not. We have one context variable whether an activity is paid or unpaid. And that's why all domestic services, unpaid domestic services have a context variable which talks about paid and unpaid, and whatever is paid goes into employment. So that exercise everybody will have to do using unit level data, and that's what we are trying to do just now. I mean, otherwise ongoing work actually. So that way there is a similarity. There is no question about non-similarity between the two. But if I can raise two issues, can I just?
If it's related, yes.
I have two questions for Dr. Mohanan. One is, you know, that the synergy between TUS and EUS is not simple, because TUS collects data for 1 or 2 days in a week, while EUS concept, ILO concept is anybody who has worked during the week. We don't have weekly information on this, and that's why we have to link it up with EUS survey, and that's why EUS is supposed to be supplementary, TUS is supposed to be supplementary to EUS. And that is precisely why the 62nd round of the NSSO, the expert group of which I was a member, passed a resolution that whenever there is a EUS conducted, it should be followed by TUS, so that the rich information that we get from EUS can be used to add to the EU employment survey. So TUS is complementary to EUS, and that can happen only if we have a common framework and common unit. And that's why we can do this, we can establish the synergy, otherwise we can't. And another thing I would like to clarify is that time use survey, even in 2019, was based on time diary, 4 in the morning to 4 next day. And this time diary was to be filled in 2019, for example, half an hour slot, and activities had to be collected based on time spent on each activity. And this is difficult, and that's why TUS sample is a very small sample compared to the larger sample, so that you can focus on a few numbers and collect the right kind of data.
Great, thank you.
Let me make
sorry, Mr. Mohan, can I just quickly have other inputs on that ILO question? Ashwini, did you want to reflect on it?
I also want to say something. Sorry. Can I or Ashwini?
Yeah, go ahead, Professor Jain.
No, I just want to say that we need a little bit, I mean, this wonderful, rich field you've exposed of people doing time in various ways. But at some point, as a feminist economist, I think we could focus on showing that there are women who are actually contributing to the economy, the GDP, but not counted, and that this issue needs to be made into a global force so that we get them to get what is called wage unionization, labor. That is such a huge group of women across Latin America, India, Asia, who are not recognized. Now, statistical recognition need not be the only thing, but it has become a source for people to recognize who is contributing. So sophisticated studies showing all the way we do it has its value, but as a part academic, part activist, I would say that if the group here would go concentrate on different countries, different regions, different parts of India, and bring up the fact that we are workers, even though we may not be recognized. And NSSO has to change. UN statistical system also has to change, because NSSO can't change unless we change them. So people like Indira, who have global presence, can actually carry this kind of advocacy and make it a little, because we are getting into more into data-based analysis. Earlier, in my earlier generation, we were very much the watching and doing, observation. But now data has become a critical tool in our hands. So we need to use it a little more forcefully on those who are marginalized, those who are invisible, and not only women, but sometimes men also. So I would say, could we go back a little bit to purpose of SAMU studies and bring it into the highlight instead of only technologies and ways of doing it? Thank you.
Absolutely. That's a point well made. Ashwini, did you want to speak about the ILO definition or?
No, we are running late, so I don't want to take up more time, but just to say that subsistence economic activities have to be included as work. So all the speakers have made the point about context. And the context in our countries is that there's a whole range of economic activities that get done in households as family businesses. In our context, that has to be counted as work. So the ILO definition only for pay and profit or not involving subsistence it doesn't work for us, because we'll be undercounting women's work. And I'm not talking about care work, I'm talking about economic work. So
Absolutely.
I think we need to have a discussion on this about how
Can I say something about that, just
Yes.
to clarify? It is counted about as work. Certainly, it is not counted as employment. So that's the difference. As long as it is for own consumption, so subsistence production, it's counted as work. It should be captured. It doesn't give you the status of employed by doing it. That's
no,
what.
The question is, if a woman is doing it, is she counted as a worker or not?
Yes.
That is the question.
Absolutely.
If she, well, just to finalize, if it depends on how what you call worker. If worker is someone who works for profit or pay, then not, because worker in that definition is equivalent to employment. But for the 19th ICLS, work is bigger than employment, and in fact, following on the Bakis, of goods, even for own consumption, are part of SNA, even if it's not part of employment.
Yeah, but in India, a lot of female workers will not get counted as workers because they are engaged in subsistence economic activities that are related to the household business, whether it's agriculture, non-farm, some shop.
No, but if it is a business, it's a different thing. If it is a business, if they are in agriculture business, that some of that production is done for sale, if it is as a business, then it is part of employment, because it's for pay.
But in India, that is one of the biggest issues about measurement, that these women don't get counted as workers. So women's contribution to economic activity is underestimated. It is an issue in Indian statistics.
Yeah.
Can I,
yes,
Prabha?
Nita, go ahead.
In Indian context, the employment survey actually follows a much broader definition. It actually also includes subsistence production. The fact is that it is not counted, most of it, because it is highly invisible. But more than that, I think in the Indian context, though the production of primary products is counted, processing of it is not counted. So I think many activities that are there in the households is also related to the processing of primary products. So that I think is something that has to be pushed in our labor force surveys, so that also gets counted as work, broader definition of work and employment, but they are not actually always housework. Can it only be counted as housework?
Right.
Can I add something? I think what Nita said is correct, but what is important is that, time use survey captures all activities comprehensively, and that's why subsistence work is counted. in time use survey. The only question is of whether we use it in our national SNA or not. And production boundary in India is limited, as Neeta was telling, and that's why we don't include that. But certain activities, not all, some processing activities we don't include. But we have a suggestion, we have made this suggestion also, that Indian concept of production boundary should match with the production boundary concept of the UNSD, and the substance work should be included. And if you see the chart that has been given in ICATUS, it includes the substance work is a part of production boundary, and that is employment. So there is no question about it.
Okay, excellent.
Can I say?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, there was two things I wanted to say. One is how the US and time use survey can be compared, like Indira ma'am raised that issue. So what I did was, the only comparable thing is the daily status, because the time use uses 1 day reference. You can't use the weekly or the usual 1 year reference period. So once you use a daily status from a comparable survey like the PLFS, it is possible to comply. But the most important thing is, in the employment unemployment surveys, we assign a status to a person for a whole day or week or year, on based on some criteria of priority or major time criteria. Whereas time use survey, you don't categorize, you don't classify a person for the whole day or anything. You have the time for different slots. So it is required to have some agreement on how do you put this individual who is doing work for 24 hours in some activity or other, not work, doing some activity. How do you identify that individual as a worker or not? Some kind of an agreement is required. Then it should be possible to specifically compare the employment figure coming from TUS and the employment unemployment surveys. So that kind of an agreement should be made, reached by the researchers. Only then you can reconcile these two set of figures, because these two represent two different aspects of the individuals. One is giving a status, other is the daily activities for 24 hours. And also, we have to also see some of the concepts are also fading now. In the pandemic, you have a situation where people have jobs, but they have no work, or people are employed, but they are not working. All these kind of situations come up now. So similar problems come in the definition of, when you can try to convert the time use into work. But I expect the researchers to work with unit level data in the coming days, because NSS reports, as I mentioned, is a very summarized form. You should use it only for checking your computations, but go for your own individual analysis and keeping your own definitions as accepted by international agencies or by your own arguments. That's all. Thank you.
Excellent. So there was a second set of questions around methodology, which I just wanted to, put out there, and then you can choose to respond to them. I think one question was for Neeta about how individuals kept time when they were actually, participating in this time use survey, and then a related question for Professor Hirve on, the question of having 10-minute slots for the evaluation, and whether there was, comparative work on the was any qualitative work which compares, different recall periods. And I guess another question also related to the methodology is about the fact that some of this activity was self-reported and some of it was collected with the help of the ANMs and the AWWs, and whether the results can be passed out within the survey report. Who would like to go first in responding to those questions?
I'll talk about the time as a variable. The thing is that it's a recall method. So individuals were asked about as to how they spend the previous day. And the time, of course, it's an important issue because people don't keep time so much in many contexts, especially in rural contexts. But I think it was a very rough, and the time was asked from 4 o'clock in the morning till the next day, 4 o'clock, the day of the interview. So, there are questions about time, and last round in 1998-99, that is why the time slot was kept as 1 hour. The reason was that women or men or rural areas especially, there is no sense of time, and a clock may not be available, and that would affect, recording it in half-an-hour slots. So this is an assumption that is then there, that people are aware of time and they are able to give those slots half an hour and report all the activities that were done in that. So that's a big assumption that we are making. So it's something which is given in the time use surveys.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, Professor Hedwig?
Yeah, actually, when we ask, recall, and ask them how you spent your time in a chronological manner, they come out with how much they have spent, how much time they have spent. But the recall memory is a very difficult thing, and that's why what we have done, for example, I designed Bangladesh time use survey, and what we have done is that the person visits the respondent 2 times a day. So morning recall and evening recall. So you get better results than what we can get, just one thing. And 30 minutes or 1 hour, of course, makes a difference. But in 30 minutes, major change that has taken place in India is that 90% of the population has mobile phone. And that's why they have access to time. In the earlier period, there was no time, sense of time so much, in particular in rural, remote areas. But now that problem has solved considerably, and that's why it is better, it is easier to collect time data from people in this context.
Great, thank you. Anyone else?
Particularly when we tell them that we are coming tomorrow to tell you about to report your time use. So they are conscious about that, and they collect the data better way and give you better results.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Shaq Charms, don't you have anything to say?
Okay, we have, so that was, do you have any thoughts on how the data was collected with the help of, women at the village level versus the self-reported data? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
I think we learned that, half of the collection of the data was conducted also by ANMs and AWWs at the village level, while half of it was self-reported, and whether the data would differ due to, I suppose, whether it would compromise the quality of the data, and whether you had anything to say about, that question. This was just a question that was posed by attendees.
Actually, school teachers and A&M workers were used to collect data in a time diary systematically. It is not that they decided how the time is spent. And in the detailed instructions which we gave was that you cannot ask any leading question. And how to ask question and how to get chronological information is a very critical thing in time use. And that's why we always concluded that interviewer is critical in getting time use survey. I'm sure Jack Shams will have something to say about his African experience.
Well, yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, in Africa, it was not so difficult to collect time use data using the diaries. In fact, all countries except, all 13 countries in Africa that have collected data on time use have used the diary method. And except Cabo Verde, where it was the stylized list. And it seems that the data collected were of good quality, and probably, as mentioned by Indira, the sense of time is better than several decades ago because of extensive use of mobile phone. So the results of these surveys are quite comparable with other countries' data, except the countries which have used stylized questions. That's what I wanted to mention. So if I have understood well, the 2019 survey of India used the diary method also, because it was ambiguous in the presentation. According to one speaker, I understood that it was a stylized list. And according to Indira, I thought it was a diary.
Okay, could we have a quick clarification, Neeta?
I think
There was no diary mentioned in the report about as. So that means they have only used the stylized questionnaire.
Okay.
No. I think they have a time diary mentioned and 30 minutes time slot they mentioned. But when they collected the data, only 60% could give the report. Could give the data on time use, but the rest of them were either, as you say, in a stylized manner, or neighbors and other household members and all of them help in the data collection, which is totally affecting the quality of data adversely.
Yes,
I think what we mean.
Yeah.
Can I say?
Yeah,
I think what I mean is that was part of the questionnaire. It's a question where they were asked to give the activities that they did for those time slots. It was listed. If that is what you call diary, I think that was there. Listing was there of the activities. But that diary is more than that. No, diary is about getting the larger variables, getting a detailed understanding of the context as such. That doesn't seem to be there at all in these time use surveys.
Now, let me clarify.
Can I say something?
Ashwini? Yeah.
I want to clarify so that can I clarify this?
Yeah, Mr. Mohanan, please go ahead.
Yeah. See, what we mean by diary method is, we give a paper to the respondent, the lady, they start noting down for half an hour what they did, and then when the investigator go to the house, they return the paper to them. So that is the way we understand a diary method. But here in this particular survey, just like any other NSS survey, the investigator did go there. Then they personally asked the individual or the proxy respondent what they did yesterday. So it is a person-to-person interview and then recording it. And what I understand is, instead of recording on a paper, they recorded on a handheld device, the activity codes. So that is the way the survey has been conducted. But my request to NSSO has been that they should come out with a report on the practical operational aspect of the survey, so that these issues are clearly put out. Thank you.
Prabha, can I just say something?
Yeah, Ashwini and Valeria. Yeah.
So in the report, it's very clearly mentioned that these were interviews. They were not, so they're called diaries, but they're not diaries that were written by people on their own time. They were interviews conducted by and the A&M question is I think there was a misunderstanding there. So the point that Mr. Mohan was making was that if there was no female enumerator, then the Anganwadi worker was sent, or the A&M was sent. So just the presence of a female person. It was not as though some people wrote diaries on their own and some other people were interviewed by A&Ms. That was not the way the survey was conducted. I think that's
the pilot had diaries. The pilot round had diaries because the report does mention.
Pilot, no, I'm talking about 2019 report.
19 doesn't have.
May I interject here?
Yes, Valeria.
What makes a diary is not the fact that someone writes there on its own. That is a self-reported diary. If a diary is filled in through an interview, still is a diary, and it has to be complete. A diary is a way of organizing questions and answers, what you were doing from 7 to 7:30, from 7:30 to 8, repetition of questions associated to a chronology of event. And what Max was comparing that was something different, which is the list of activities, which can be short or exhaustive. Is if I ask you, did you do the dishes yesterday? That is the difference. So one is a list of activities and the other is a chronology of events, no matter how it's filled in. So a diary is not a diary because it's a European type of diary left behind. That's not what makes a diary a diary. A diary is a diary because it's a chronology of events, even if it is reported through an interview. And let's, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have two other hands that are up. One is Cecilia Tinubun and Monica Banerjee. Cecilia, do you want to go first? Do you have a question? Cecilia, do you have a question?
Yes, sorry, my microphone was muted.
Sure, go ahead.
Good evening. I would like to congratulate with the speakers and everybody that work on the first time use survey in India. My name is Cecilia. I work for UN Women in Statistics in Asia and Pacific. And as you know, we are actively working on the measurement of unpaid domestic and care work through time use survey as also co-custodian of SDG 5.4.1. I have one comment and one question. One comment is basically to reinforce some of the statements that my colleague had, like Valeria and Professor Indira Hirway, in the sense that it's true that the international statistical community is very much focusing on engendering statistics and ensuring that the production of official statistics as gender lens. And obviously UN Women has launched a statistical program in 2016 that actually strongly and work actively to ensure that women's work is recognized in official statistics. And the 19 SLS has been a major milestone in this process because allows not only to recognize unpaid domestic and care work in official statistics as a form of work, but also allows policymakers to have a set of data on different forms of work that allow better targeting and therefore more effective policy making. And there is actually a working group right now coordinated by UNSD, for which UN Women is part of, that is actually looking at the revision of standard and guidelines to implement ICATUS 2016. And the focus is obviously on different forms of work, productive and also personal activities, with a strong focus on modernizing the collection of time use statistics through light time use diaries and CAPI and methodology. So just to say that, you know, like the UN is strongly focusing on this topic, which is a high priority, especially because during COVID-19, I'm very pleased that a colleague before shared the BBC link. We have conducted more than 50 rapid assessment surveys worldwide and focusing on unpaid domestic and care work, and we noticed how much this form of work has gained relevance during the COVID-19 pandemic, which on one side is very unfortunate, but on the other side has really waken up, the attention of the media, policymakers, economists, on the valuable contribution that women give to the economy and society, not only on a normal day, but also during a pandemic. So I'm really glad that there has been visibility on this topic. My question is on policy use. What are the plans for using the data that's been produced so far, if there are any, and what is the discussion about using this data for change? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Cecilia. Would anyone like to speak to that? I think there are more questions on the issues of diaries, but I think Mr. Mohanan had his hand up. Did you want to come speak about that question?
Yeah,
or?
I wanted to clarify. I don't know what Valeria said about diaries is not what we do in the in Indian context. When we say diary, which means we give a physical diary or a notebook to the respondent to note down what they do it, and we did that in the case of household in expenditure, item-wise expenditure, sometime back in the NSS. So we did a pilot where we gave a notebook to them, asking them to record. But when the interviewer goes there asking activities for different days or different time slots, we don't call it diary. So diary has a specific meaning which is self-reported by the respondent on a paper or a notebook, and then that is collected by the respondent and transferred to her questionnaire. That is the diary method we use it. So I don't think there is any confusion for us when we say diary and the non-diary.
Okay, I see. Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a question. There's a question for Ashwini, which is about how the data on self-care and maintenance, it shows that men and women spend more or less the same amount of time, and whether you had any reflections on that.
No, nothing. I haven't looked at the raw data. I've only read the report, and from the report it seems like the total time is similar. I think within that, the division might be different. But since that's all I have seen right now, I have no comments. I'll have to look at the raw data and see how it splits.
Yeah.
By the way, there are caste differences and within that. So, for example, time of sleep and all of that is a little bit different.
Absolutely. I think we are a bit.
Can I just come in on this question? Can I just come in?
Sure.
This is Mridu Leepan. I'm one of the, I mean, I don't know, guest or what. No, I just, this data on, what is it called? The self-care and maintenance. That really puzzled me. And I thought that it was very necessary. You see, if you look at it in terms of hours, it's almost 12 hours the females spend on self-care and maintenance. That table they have given. And I'm not talking from the report, but the tables that have appeared in the newspapers, this is 12 hours almost, you see, 724 minutes in a day. So I was also very puzzled. And then I thought perhaps, Ashwini, what you have done, disaggregating by age, that becomes very important here. You see, the 6-year being compared with an older woman, for instance, could be making this a number like that. That's what I felt, my gut reaction to that number.
Mridul, this is a table from the report. As I said, I haven't looked at the raw data.
No, I'm not talking about the raw data. I'm not talking about the raw data. This is actually the Press Information Bureau. The Press Information Bureau, after this report came out, they gave the basic tables, just the basic tables. So they have given this number of minutes of participants spent in a day, number of minutes. And the number of minutes is 724 for a female. That comes to, if you divide by 60, it comes to almost 12 hours. You see? So that made me really, it made me very...
One has to look at the raw data and one has to look at each of these activities and separate by age. Only then we'll get at the bottom of this.
Nita, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I actually want. When I was looking at the data, I also saw this huge, proportion going for this category. But what I feel is that there is underreporting of care services given to other members, which gets reflected. Even if you look at, there is some disaggregation across age that is available in the report. That also shows almost the same. So it means that, everyone, I cannot believe that everyone, even at that age group, everyone is sleeping or having food and all that, individual time spent is 12 hours. So I think there is a lot of misreporting on other categories, which is why this category is getting over-reported.
Okay.
But I think one also has to keep in mind that self-services, the third category of activities, also includes socializing, going to temple, religion, etc., studying, using computer or whatever, sports, everything it includes. So it won't be just 8 hours, it will be more than 8 hours, but how much they have done is to be seen. I have not seen the data, but when I just clarify that it doesn't include sleep, but it also includes many other things like chatting and talking and watching TV and all those things, because nobody else can watch TV for you. So it includes large number of activities.
No, that's not correct, Professor Hirve. The categories that comes under self-care and maintenance are sleep and related activities, eating and drinking, personal hygiene and care, receiving personal and health medical care from others, traveling time related to self-care and maintenance activities, other self-care and maintenance activities. The rest is gone to another category.
No, so that's the other category. Indra, that's the other category. Socializing and communication, community participation.
That is a different category.
That's a different category altogether.
Self-maintenance and self-care only consists of these categories, and this is clearly an over-representation. And I think it's because of underreporting of other categories.
I think there is some kind of confusion here, because this is not possible. Even self-care or activities which cannot be delegated to somebody else, that is the third kind of activities, which includes sleep, studying, learning, doing some special courses, unpaid courses kind of, or socializing, going to temple, everything it includes. So if you're talking about the third category of activities, then it includes everything. But if you're talking about only self-care, then there is a problem.
It is only Indira, about self-care. It is only self-care.
Yeah, Indira, there's a table. There's a table like that. There's a table like that, giving in minutes. It's something printed, One is just quoting from there.
I have seen the table.
Yeah,
I have actually put it up. but there was no time to discuss it. I had actually marked.
Maybe you can put it up. Maybe you can put it up quickly.
No, now I think it's okay.
I'll check that. I'll check that.
Wonderful. So I just want to, I think we are quite over the time. So I just wanted to come back to Cecilia's question on, the uptake and bring it back to what Professor Jain, has exhorted us to do, which is to not get mired in the depoliticizing effects of measurement and the nuances. It's quite important, obviously, even for policy advocacy reasons. But, how do we now mobilize this information to push forward political projects for recognition of women as workers? So I just want to give all of you an opportunity to reflect on this policy uptake question before we conclude the webinar. So I would like to start in the reverse order. Maybe Valeria, do you want to speak to this question?
Yes, thank you. Just to emphasize that this effort makes sense if we use them to bring up transformative change and bring up a feminist and care agenda. It is why we've been doing this, and that connects exactly with what Devaki was opening with, and why, as Cecilia emphasized and others, we are going through these efforts. We understand visibility as the initial step towards bringing up change, and that is something that we shouldn't be losing sight of. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you. Mr. Mohanan?
Yeah, this is strictly not my area. All that I would say is that the kind of interest that is that will be generated based on this report might influence the government to do this survey more frequently. In fact, the recommendation of the Statistical Commission was to do this once in 3 years. So let us hope that if the interest generated, they might actually do that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Professor Hirve?
We have discussed enough, so I don't want to say anything more about it, but I will only say one thing, and that is feminist agenda, that it has two important implications of time use data. One is that if we do the valuation, the way national income accounts are done, which I have discussed in one of my articles, then it will be possible to merge unpaid work, value of unpaid work, which includes capital, technology, everything, with the GDP, and that will give you the real contribution of women to national income. That's one thing. And secondly, what I would like to say is that paid work and unpaid work are very important aspects of women, and both are important from gender point of view, and we have to study this in details. And of course, we have to change the methodology considerably.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Professor Deshpande?
Yeah, no, obviously it has to form a part of the policy apparatus. It's just that many of our countries are going through challenging times in terms of the liaison between the governments and academics. Often it's not so smooth. So I hope the government is willing to listen. India has a huge amount of scientific expertise. I mean science in a broad way, as in knowledge producing. And I think that now is the time actually to come for the policymakers and the scientific community to come together. But there are challenges in that process, and I hope they get resolved soon.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ashwini. Professor Neeta?
I think there are a lot of policy possibilities come from this TUS. One, I think most important is that it is further actually, in a sense, helping us to work towards advocating inclusion of unpaid economic work into our labor force surveys. That is, I think, very important, because this is showing, clearly an invisibility, the issue of invisibility. And second, and I think the important question that has now been, there in the Indian context is about declining women's work participation rate. And in this context, actually, the discussion that is there is about housework hindering economic participation. So, this is an opportunity for us to actually analyze and look at the unit level data and get inputs in terms of actually understanding of that dimension better. And I think there's a possibility there. And I hope in the future to come, the time use survey should be considered alongside the the employment unemployment survey. So we have large set of data, and that integration is something that also needs to be now pushed forward, and I hope that happens. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Professor Jain, finally. Is Professor Jain with us? Or okay. I'm not sure if she's still there or not, but I just want to thank you all very, very much, for this discussion. Obviously, that it's quite wide-ranging, and there are many ways of trying to, first actually comprehend the data, understand the methodology behind it, fit it into how it works with other sort of labor force assessment studies, and how then it feeds back into law and policy, given the current political climate. All of those are huge challenges. But I thank you very much for sharing your expertise and your passion on this issue. And we will definitely share what we've learned today with you. And we look forward to staying in touch. Thank you very, very much to all of you, and to all the participants who've been very, very patient. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.